Welcome, everybody. Thank you for joining us today for this session of TRT World Forum Digital Debates. Ukraine-Russia tensions, can diplomacy prevail? The tensions on the Russian-Ukrainian border have pivoted into a deadlock following Moscow's amassing over 100,000 troops near the Ukrainian border and its issuing of a list of demands, including security guarantees from the US and NATO that there would be no further eastward expansion of the security alliance. Additionally, a series of diplomatic exchanges between the US, Russia, NATO, and Ukraine have revealed that the gap between the expectations of the parties has little possibility of being bridged. Despite the Kremlin's reiterations that it has no intention to invade Ukraine, the continued military buildup near the Russian-Ukrainian border has sparked international concerns about a possible Russian military offensive. What does Russia really want in Ukraine, and why is it acting now? What are Russia's military options in Ukraine? Can NATO and Europe deter Russia from invading? And what would be the consequences of a possible war in Ukraine for the security architecture of Europe? My name is Michael Arnold. I am a researcher and editor at the TRT World Research Center. And joining me for this discussion is Mr. Barry Prevail, Senior Vice President and Director of the Snowcroft Center for Strategy and Security at the Atlantic Council. Natalia Humenyuk. She's a Ukrainian journalist and founder of the Public Interest Journalism Lab, and Dr. Talha Kuze, the Brussels coordinator for SETA. Thank you so much for joining us this evening or this afternoon, depending on where you are located. And on that note, we'll just get right into the discussion. So, Natalia, I want to open with you. I want to get a sense of sort of the most recent updates on the ground in Ukraine. As things stand today, what is the move in Kiev, both amongst Ukrainian officials and amongst the wider Ukrainian public? Moreover, specifically, I'm wondering if you can speak a little bit to the situation on Ukraine's borders and in the border regions, particularly in the east, where, of course, there has been an ongoing conflict since 2014. How would people in eastern Ukraine in particular react to a renewed Russian incursion?
Hi, good to talk to you. And yeah, I'm happy to share the situation on the ground. It differs from the capital to different places. Probably to the context, it's worth to add that the troops are on the Ukrainian border. However, technically, on the Ukrainian side or on the Ukrainian government control territory, since October or November, nothing really had happened. Militarily wise, the situation is even calmer than it was before. At least that's what I understand from the reports. So it's all about this anxiety and the feeling of threat. And if in the in December and especially in January, when we all got to this situation, there was more shock and even some denial because Russia is such a formidable force, and it's the threat, announced threat, was so huge. There was this shock, but not panic. So there was never here any kind of people going and trying to buy something in the groceries or like moving somewhere, but people started to think how to prepare, what could be done. Also because if you really look even into the military analysis of different think tanks, analysts, international Ukrainians, you understand that scenarios could be multiple. And they are so different that it's super hard to understand what to prepare for. So should it be an airstrike on the capital? Something overtaking one of the city on the Ukrainian border, some escalation in the occupied Donbass, overtaking some water channels from Crimea, or maybe the blockade of the attack of the Navy near Odessa or in the Black Sea. These are all totally different things. So there were demands for the government to explain to what to prepare, but in this situation, because we do not really fully know what might happen, we can go for that, why we don't know about that, discuss that further. That's super hard. However, on the ground, of course, independently, it's necessary to verify. I'm a journalist, so we talk to the people, we ask the government to explain, the Minister of Defense or was speaking to the parliament and explain, that military are on alert, there are preparation. We know that there are more, supply or some support for defense coming from international partners. So it's there, and the people are now in the mood that what should we do, how we could plan. But generally, people became confident more and more that Ukrainian task in case of the Russian attack is, to show that Ukraine is unconquerable, even if it would be very damaging. It's a big country with a big army. So that's from this point of view. But on human point of view, I also should differentiate. It's very odd so far. Probably people in Kiev are the most worried because this is a very psychological pressure, and because so people are concerned whether something should be done to shock the country, to do something totally unexpected, and that is, of course, attack on the capital, which is something air attack or something like that, because. People from the inner eastern towns, they are not fleeing. I've traveled to the city of Kharkiv, one of the biggest cities in the Ukraine, 30 kilometers from the Russian border. And they said, like, okay, I talked to sociologists there, and they said, like, it before people thought, like, it's our land. Why should we leave? We would stay and we would resist. Most strange is indeed talking to the people to all these towns. And we have hundreds of kilometers of the conflict line in the near the occupied Donbass. People there are incredibly calm because they said, like, we're living with the war for the 8 years. Look, they even like a bit cynical, looking like, okay, look, that's our everyday situation. We live in the situation of this threat. So there, it's totally different. So that would be my real take. But just shortly to add, we shouldn't forget that though on the diplomatic level, situation seems like becoming, more calmer, more interactions, more discussions, but more and more troops are on the Ukrainian border. So if there were a bit more than 100,000 in autumn, we have 130,005 today, and we also have the military, the navy, more Russian navy coming to the Black Sea. So indeed, there are more troops, but more dialogue.
Thank you, Natalia, and we'll get a little bit into those some of those scenarios in a bit. Of course, and as you mentioned, there's more than 100,000 troops, and now I've tens of thousands, if not more, in Belarus as well. So this opens up this idea of the vulnerability of Kiev. But Mr. Prevail, I want to come to you and speak a little bit about the situation, I guess, from a more global perspective. So, of course, Russia has argued that its interests in Ukraine are based almost entirely on what it says it views as security concerns with regards to NATO expansion. What are the sort of indications of this, and what are the arguments that the Russians are putting forward? What do you believe that Putin really wants in Ukraine, and is there any sort of, let's say, legitimacy, or is any sort of reality to the claims that Russia is making publicly about the Ukraine crisis?
Thanks very much. Divining Putin's real motives is always risky business, but I'll give you my speculation nonetheless. I mean, I think it's pretty clear his ideal world is where the Russian Federation is treated in the world the way the USSR was treated during the Cold War. It's one of the major superpowers. It's given respect. It has an enormous sphere of influence and dominates states in its neighborhood. Obviously, that ain't happening. So that's his fondest dreams. I think he wants to cement his legacy and history. He is getting older and realizes this. I have a hard time thinking that the concerns expressed about NATO are real. I mean, certainly the former Warsaw Pact members in Eastern Europe have now become members of the NATO alliance out of their own free will, which is a very important point. They're making sovereign decisions to join like-minded democracies in an alliance. And this is actually the very scenario that led many of them to join. They wanted protection in case Russia once again sought to be aggressive. But it's hard to understand. I mean, does Vladimir Putin really fear NATO attacking Russia? What would NATO gain from that? His claims that NATO would put missiles into Ukraine and use those to attack Russia are ludicrous. There's no track record of NATO being aggressive against Russia. NATO's fondest desire was for the Cold War to be put way behind it, but it seems to be coming back. Now, Putin's real fear, I think, if you really pushed him, is losing his grip on power, is a democratic revolution in Russia. And so his real fear about Ukraine might be, again, speculation, might be this country becomes more democratic, becomes more part of the West in terms of economic structures, becomes a thriving democracy, and the Russian people start seeing that. That's probably the real threat that Vladimir Putin is most worried about.
Yeah, thank you for that. I was listening I believe it was yesterday, the day before, to the joint press conference from Vladimir Putin and Macron, and there seemed to be this acknowledgement from Putin that Russia can't match sort of NATO's combined forces. However, he did point to this idea that Russia remains a global nuclear power, sort of to put that into this point of saying, while we may not be able to match you here, we do have this sort of capability in the background. I'm wondering if you can kind of speak to that aspect briefly as well.
Yes, I mean, so my understanding of the Russian invasion of Georgia in 2008 was that they came away thinking our military needs to improve a lot. They had a hard time communicating, very, very small operation for the size of Russian military and their capabilities. And so in the intervening decade plus, they have really modernized. They have really invested numerous new types of strategic forces, a lot more capability in their other forces. We'll see yet of how good they are at sort of high-level joint operations across their services. Not sure yet about that. But anyway, they are a force, a military force now that has to be taken very seriously. And so that leads me to the opportunity. So this is a crisis. It's a Russian-generated crisis. I think ultimately, if Putin goes ahead, it's going to actually turn out very badly for him. What happened in Afghanistan, where the mothers of the dead soldiers came back and really caused them to withdraw, I think that would probably happen in this case as well, because there'll be a lot of dead Russian soldiers if he goes ahead and does some version of what Natalia laid out here. But the opportunity for me is all of the stabilizing measures that contributed to the European security order that were a leftover of the Cold War, but that played a very useful role. Those are pretty much almost all gone now. And so is this an opportunity? Now, as you rightly pointed out, Russian forces, in particular strategic forces, are very serious and world leading in many areas. Is this an opportunity to look anew at arms control, at confidence building measures, other forms of transparency and stabilization? And I think that's what the Biden administration and the NATO proposals likely centered on in terms of the parts of the Russian document that could be explored further. That's where I think there's a lot of gold. And so maybe, Russia has violated the INF treaty, so everybody got out. Violated Open Skies Treaty, everybody got out. There's a number of treaties that are no longer extant, a number of procedures that are no longer in force. We should look at adapting those for the new circumstances we're in. But I think as long as they're based on the principle of reciprocity, in other words, sure, NATO forces won't be in this area. Well, we need Russian forces then to not be in that area, if you understand what I'm saying. And so I think that's an opportunity that we should pursue, that the West should pursue with vigor, because this is a good chance to lay the groundwork for a more stable European order if it's adapted to the current times.
Thank you. And Dr. Köse, of course, Turkey has a lot at stake in this issue, both geographically in terms of the region where any potential conflict could take place in the Black Sea area, but of course, as well as a key member of NATO, and of course, a country with the major stake in European security architecture. Of course, Turkey undertakes this sort of delicate balance on the one hand of being one of the major supporters of Ukraine, both, let's say, morally speaking, but as well in terms of actual capabilities as well, while also maintaining this sort of complicated relationship with Moscow. In his recent visit to Kiev last week, Turkish President Erdogan offered to mediate between Ukraine and Russia. This is, of course, in conjunction with various other diplomatic initiatives. How can Turkey play a role in easing Ukraine-Russia tensions, given that Turkey has this sort of relationship with both nations? And what do you think that the prospects for movement in this direction are?
I think Turkey is a trusted partner for both Russia and Ukraine. So President Erdogan signed a free trade agreement with Ukraine in his trip. There is strong military cooperation, strategic cooperation between Turkey and Ukraine, and there's an increasing economic and human communication and cooperation between Turkey and Ukraine. And Turkey clearly took a sign criticizing and not accepting annexation of Crimea. So in that line, I think there's a very strong, the relations between Turkey and Ukraine developed very strongly in the last decade. On the other hand, Turkish-Russian relations have been tested several times, and it's a very difficult relationship, to be honest. In the last couple of years, we faced this shooting of the Russian fighter on Turkish-Syrian border. That was very difficult situation in Syria, in Libya. Turkey and Russia stood in different lines. But despite all, and actually, Russian ambassador to Turkey has been shot by a terrorist who was wearing a police uniform, which was also a tense moment. So despite all these difficulties, Turkish and Russian presidents managed their relations delicately. And they managed to, despite all these differences, they managed some cooperation in the energy field. Russia is investing in Turkish, reactor, and also in tourism areas. And with this recent crisis in Nagorno-Karabakh, Turkey and Russia also coordinated their efforts. So we know that in this crisis, Turkey and Russia have very different positions. Turkey clearly is a side. Turkey is not a neutral party in this game. Turkey is a NATO member, second largest military in NATO, and has some difficulties with Russia. But despite all these issues, I think Turkish and Russian presidents can communicate and coordinate. So in this capacity, I think, not in terms of active mediation, but communicator, reassurer. So there are different forms of mediation, different types of mediation. Turkey can play a significant role in this. But if the situation also escalates further, Turkish involvement may mitigate. But if things go out of control, and if NATO somehow gets involved in the situation, I think it would be very difficult for Turkey to play this mediator role. So for the time being, it's for Turkey's interest to keep this situation de-escalated, find some common ground and reduce the tension despite all these difficulties. And Turkey still plays the trusted actor because in the middle of this crisis, President Erdogan's visit to Kiev was important, and President Putin is also invited to Ankara, and he sent positive message. So it seems that this communication and reassuring position may work well, but if the things go out of control, if they get further escalated, I think Turkish position and Turkish contributions may stay a little bit more limited.
Thank you for that, Dr. Kuze. Natalia, I want to come back to you. We've been speaking a bit, and Mr. Prevail was speaking to it. The idea of divining Putin's intentions is, of course, difficult. So of course it would appear that at this point only Putin knows what he's really planning to do in Ukraine, with multiple scenarios, some of which that you mentioned in your opening remarks still on the table, of course, ranging from this full-scale invasion to continued pressure with ongoing military buildup to extract concessions. Do you believe that there's a sense in Kiev amongst the government circle that renewed conflict is inevitable, or are there genuine hopes that a diplomatic solution can still be found to this present crisis at least?
The government demonstrate not really confidence, but really hope that the crisis is definitely not inevitable, and all possible efforts should be done in order to avoid a military, a kind of a larger war. That was all often in the president's address. I think even like a lot of international media were quite surprised why the Ukrainian president, even asked the international press not to portray this something as an inevitable. Government, of course, confirms, and working with partners says that this threat is huge and the troops are there. However, they also think that there is a huge damage to the economy already by the current situation. And they also think that for Ukraine strategically, anyway, the conflict would last long. And even this destructive situation, that's what Ukraine needs to do, because it could happen that, now there are more talks and anxiety, and later there would be less attention, less of international partners, of everything, and things might happen in summer, in spring, in a year or so. So it's like a permanent threat of this kind. So kind of the threat was there for 8 years. However, we haven't heard this, demands and this level of it. And also the government really tries to de-escalate. So I think and which is quite unusual and quite paradoxical, because in this situation, in a country at war, you always have the political force who wants to play in this military into military mode, because politically it's actually probably something good it's easy to mobilize the people, but the government is extremely cautious, not to create more conflict on the ground and also the fact that, for instance, the President Erdogan was in Kiev also is showing this, because of course the initial discussions were about between NATO and the US and Russia. Ukraine was consulted. However, Ukrainians understood that there are no chances to have that the NATO troops won't be here on the ground. So, and even if there won't be unity in NATO, it's very important to talk to individual members and maintain the support of individual partners. So, discussion about that was very, very, the visit of the President Erdogan was devoted to 30 years of Ukrainian-Turkish relations. Also, they signed a very important free trade agreement, which has been debated for 15 years. They have quite a good relations, but also Turkey, for instance, had the history of managing to free two of very famous Crimean Tatars political leaders, which had been detained in Russia years ago. And now, when we have more than 130 political prisoners in Crimea, mainly Crimean Tatar community, it's a Ukrainian indigenous population, Muslim minority, with a strong ties to Turkey. There was always this connection that President Erdogan could play its role. So that shows that there is real effort to avoid war at any reasonable cost, without, of course, losing Ukrainian sovereignty, principle, democracy, and let's say, a critical things. And statehood, of course.
Just before I move on, I just want to follow up briefly on this point of media coverage. And you mentioned, the Ukrainian president sort of publicly appealing to international media to sort of, tone down what he saw as sort of, perhaps over the top rhetoric. How has the media coverage in Ukraine been of Ukrainian media of this crisis, and how is that compared to what you've seen from the international press in particular?
Yeah, it differs. First of all, for international media, Ukraine was still a new terrain. We haven't seen that many of them, even like 8 years ago when there was a Euromaidan revolution, when there was the start of the war. And I think that the Ukrainians are overall grateful for this attention, because it's taken a lot of time for Ukrainians to explain that this threat is there. It's not just about Ukraine. This discussion is not really about some kind of minor conflict in Ukraine. It's about global security architecture. Ukraine is unfortunately is used by Russia in this situation. But I think that for some moment, some of the media, there was extremely good coverage. There was not so good. They didn't really understood that the war here is very political. That like you don't come here and use it's a Kiev today is a perfect European capital, with restaurants full, people celebrating New Year and things like that. Maybe some of the media were coming here and expecting kind of a very cliche way of seeing the war, and were quite disappointed. Like, oh, it's not there. Where should we find those refugees or people crying, or I don't know, like this very cliche way. So that was a bit of the moment. But what President Zelensky referred is really how harmful it could be to economy, because we can't really say that it's imminent, that it's inevitable, because also by accepting that it's inevitable, you kind of normalize something which shouldn't happen. So it's important for the population. It's important for just going on, because if you're really not creating the panic. And also probably a lot of media and analysts in the very beginning didn't really fully understand the terrain. So maybe for them something sounded like taking over Ukraine is like taking over the small country, but it's a huge country, just size-wise. So even if something happened, it's true that Russia is a formidable force. It's capable, but it won't be like right now. So of course, the headline that Kyiv can be taken within something, it can with Russian weapon and with modernized army. A lot of things are possible, but it can be said that because at some moment when I was also asked in numerous international networks, the question was not really like if the war would start. It was like when it start. Would it start tomorrow? Like should it be next week? However, we should be a bit more sensitive, but also it's hard to balance. The threat is there. It's big, but also we can't undermine it. But now the coverage is way more nuanced, which I think is very well appreciated.
Mr. Prevail, I'll come to you here. Of course, as we've been discussing, ongoing talks between the parties, whether between NATO, Ukraine, Russia in particular, as well as the United States, haven't achieved any major breakthrough thus far. You mentioned where there are some, possible opportunities to pursue, diplomatic solutions on specific issues. Do you believe that these sorts of diplomatic measures alone can help solve the ongoing crisis, particularly in the short term? Of course, understanding that there are longer term issues at play here. But do you believe that these measures alone can solve the crisis, or do you believe that other measures should be put in place? President Biden, of course, and others have mentioned the specter of harsh sanctions should a Russian incursion occur. But of course, there has been also some skepticism raised of the ability of sanctions to actually deter Russia for a variety of reasons, some of which have incurred its large foreign currency reserves, leverage over Europe in terms of energy, etc. So is this diplomatic track alone enough to solve the crisis? What are potential other measures, and how effective could these measures actually be?
It's a great question. It's ultimately unanswerable because we don't know what Vladimir Putin is thinking. Most of my thinking is that this is all part of the plan. It's a charade. He's a former KGB officer. This is what they do. And then we've seen the very voluminous reporting of the intelligence operations, regarding the false flag, creating pretexts for saving Russian citizens and going in one of the many ways that Natalia outlined at the very beginning, which I thought was a very good rendering of the potential parameters of a military offensive. So, I lean toward the charade theory, and that Putin will do whatever he was planning to do. But one can be hopeful, as I said. Now the deterrent has three parts, and it's complicated. One is, sanctions closer and more focused, like a precision-guided missile, on the Russian leadership. So these are Putin and his, close advisors and oligarchs. They would feel this in a way they've never felt sanctions before, is my understanding. But these also would hurt European private sector leaders who do business with these oligarchs. So that's tough. Will it deter Putin? Hard to say. You're right. There's not a great track record. Second, providing arms and defensive equipment to the Ukrainian military and security services, and really making any attempt to occupy Ukraine extraordinarily costly. And I think that part of the deterrent should be dialed up significantly. These are defensive weapons. You could talk about IEDs, which is ultimately what got forces out of Afghanistan and out of Iraq. And so I think you could really make Russia pay a heavy, heavy price that threatens Putin in Moscow. And if you do that right, I would do more of that. The third one is, okay, we're going to defend put more forces on NATO's current eastern flank. I think that's more of a warning that, okay, Putin, if you do this, the security situation when it's over is going to be much less favorable for Russia than it was beforehand. You'll have more forces, as the NATO Secretary General said at the Atlantic Council, not less. So it would actually, play out very badly for the Russian military in that regard. This is a tough deterrent message, though, right? Ukraine's not an alliance member. So a lot of people, besides those on this broadcast, but some people forget that. And so it's a complicated message. I'm not sure if it would work. My own view is there should be a fourth leg, and that should be a very steady campaign to the Russian people and to others about Putin's bank accounts, his family's bank accounts, how much money he's gotten. There's no reason that democratic societies can't go on the offense in the hybrid domain, in the gray zone. And here, to me, truth is the selling point, and we should really do a much more strategic job of outing Putin and the corruption that keeps him and his family in multiple houses and billions of dollars. Whether that would ultimately deter Putin from whatever he decides he wants to do, who knows at this point. But when you're trying to deter someone, you have to focus on what they are most concerned about. And Putin's most concerned about is hold on power. So how does the West deter Putin from acting by getting as close to putting at risk his hold on power as can possibly be done?
President Biden recently mentioned that if there was a Russian move into Ukraine, that Nord Stream 2 would be effectively canceled. How does that sort of that potential play into what you're talking about in terms of the idea of ramping up the pressure in various ways that makes maybe Putin a bit anxious about his hold on power in Russia? And then for that instance, how did the European allies, particularly Germany in this case, respond to such an idea?
Yeah, I think as we've seen over the last 10 days or so, the new German leadership is finding its way, trying to get its moorings in terms of its posture on a very complex crisis that it's facing in its first days. So I'm giving them a little bit of a break. But I think they ultimately will kind of saddle up. And I think, if it comes to that, and if I were Putin, who seems to be pretty deft at managing the various tools of Russian statecraft, if I were Putin, I wouldn't make that part easy, right? I would do something in the middle and not the all-out thing that would trigger that kind of reaction. So I think that, not again, hard to say how he will act. I think that the outcome that would trigger that eventuality in a patently obvious way, that's probably less likely of a scenario of the ones that Natalia outlined than something more subtle, something more nuanced, something that doesn't make that as an obvious response by the West. But that would hurt. One thing that would have to be done for that to happen is, okay, then where does Europe get its energy from? And so we really need to step up and make the answers to that crystal clear, because this is a near-term question. It's not a theoretical question, and it's not a 2023 question. It's a now question. And I think I have not yet seen sort of a very clear, definitive answer to the question of, okay, if that is banned, where does Europe get its energy from?
Dr. Köse, switching gears a little bit and talking about this European security architecture and in fact global security architecture that Natalia was pointing to. French President Macron recently said that security and stability plan, any security and stability plan that involves Ukraine should first be built among Europeans and then shared with NATO allies. Of course, this is reflecting his penchant for advancing the notion of European strategic autonomy. However, it appears that EU member states themselves are not in full lockstep on how to respond to Russia in this case. What are sort of some of these key barriers that are standing in the way of this European unanimity on Ukraine? And what does it say about the EU's ability to, on its own, to sort of guarantee European security?
I think there's a huge fragmentation within Europe. So while French President Emmanuel Macron was in Moscow, German Chancellor Olaf Scholz was in Washington. So the messages that are given at Washington and Moscow were quite different messages. So Germany was quite criticized about its stance on this issue. Definitely wants to coordinate further with NATO and US in this issue. On the other hand, French side supports the strategic autonomy. But all these tensions demonstrate the vulnerabilities of the European security and deficiencies of the strategic autonomy debate. Because once this crisis started, other member countries gave different positions. I mean, some of them said that this is outside of the domain of the NATO. We may consider sanctions, but we should stay out of the military game. On the other hand, countries like Poland and Baltic states were more committed to NATO, and also, they wanted to stand stronger. UK also played very strong role. But if you look at some other countries, for instance, Italy, at some point, Greece, Hungary, and to a certain extent, Spain, they were quite reluctant to provide military. So, if the situations go out of control, they would definitely play a stronger role. But, countries like Finland and Sweden may even consider getting further involved with NATO if the tensions increase. So I think this issue, blackmail may backfire for Vladimir Putin, because NATO was already considered as brain dead by French side, and there were some other political leaders in Europe who believe in the similar way. But as it is demonstrated, NATO still is very strong, and many countries in Europe are quite committed to NATO, and they believe that only NATO can counter this. So this gave, I think, the new life to NATO, and even some countries, as I mentioned, Sweden and Finland may consider. And for the other smaller countries, I think there may be further incentives to join NATO. So I think if Moscow increases the pressure, I think there will be further engagement with NATO. Alliance may get strengthened, and the idea of strategic autonomy may be postponed, not necessarily completely avoided or forgotten, but it may be postponed until a crisis like this is handled. So I think there is a clear fragmentation in Europe. Most of the EU members and NATO members do not want military tension, military confrontation. They make it clear. UK and Poland and US have a different position, but it is not sufficient. But what makes it more clear for Europe is that NATO is clearly important as fundamental pillar of European security architecture. And for some of the other neutral countries, they may be even more interested to be part of NATO or increase their cooperation with NATO. So these are the side effects of this pressure. And I think President Putin will consider and will follow what's going on those grounds. So I think some countries also, we know that in Hungary, in the past, Bulgaria, there were some concerns with regard to, and in Germany also within the coalition, there are different ideas about how to engage with, Russia. That's also another issue. It's not surfaced clearly, but the experts know that there are even differences of opinion. So I think this is a fragmented Europe, fragmented NATO is good for Putin. But if he pushes further, I think he can bring all these actors together, and this may be really a negative consequence of this crisis.
I want a bit to jump on that. In
Sure,
particular,
go ahead,
I think like Ukrainians are looking at this fragmentation, but it's also very important that, of course, nobody wants to have some quarrels and arguments between the allies. That's tricky, but we can also understand that countries, we could have local, the governments could have local political agendas. So therefore, in particular, Ukraine is trying to work with different countries directly. But it's true that the neutrality is something which today do not work at all. And that is the major question, because that's exactly what provokes Putin. Because a lot of people always trying, especially analysts, trying to impose to Ukraine this idea why Ukraine can't be neutral. But the problem that exactly because it's neutral, it has been attacked. So the bigger question is, we know that Ukraine won't join NATO in the nearest future, but what is the today's security architecture in which the countries which aspire democracy, which want to, follow the rule of law, stay democratic, how can they be protected if it happened that they haven't managed to become the member of the alliance, in the good times in early 2000? And this is answer not just for Ukraine, it's for Moldova, the Caucasus countries, Georgia, and some others. So and as well, probably to add something to what the colleague said with the Western response. I think that this determination and the defense support, in fact, works, because there is this debate about, like, do we provoke NATO? Is it making situation worse? What provokes is exactly the weakness. And today, I think the US and the international partners help Ukraine to buy some time, to be more prepared today. Because what Russia does, it attacks all of a sudden when the country is in disarray, when the government is not prepared, when the military are not prepared. It makes them more, willingness to do so. For those who trying to say that, neutrality will calm down the situation, I definitely say that's not how Ukrainian thinks. And also the polls are showing that in this situation, even people who didn't maybe want to join NATO earlier, they are supportive of this idea, because they don't see any other options. Because the only reason Ukraine can't be fully protected, it's because it's not in NATO. And just to mention, which rarely mentioned often, that, for instance, Ukraine had this guarantee by US, the UK, and Russia by Budapest Memorandum, when in 1994 it's given this nuclear arms as a guarantee for the security from those three partners. And we understood it didn't work. Russia occupied Crimea, and technically it's not really, this memorandum is not something which can be used instead of like a membership in the alliance or the real defense support.
Thank you for that, Natalia. So, Mr. Barry Prevail, as Dr. Koze and Natalia have both sort of alluded to, there's this possibility of this sort of backfiring on Russia and Vladimir Putin in terms of perhaps reviving a certain spirit amongst NATO that seemed to kind of have been in disarray, with the pullout from Afghanistan, from sort of the years coming from that, and there's perhaps a sense of renewed mission amongst alliance members, and as Natalia mentioned, amongst those who and Dr. Koze mentioned, who perhaps were not as interested in getting involved with NATO in earlier times because of the specific threat that's emerging now. However, of course, there has been this specter of division that we've been discussing amongst NATO members, has been raised on several occasions, most notably by President Biden, who his officials came out to try to walk back some of those public statements in terms of perhaps being too open about some of these divisions. Of course, the meeting with the German Chancellor, it seems that some of that has been smoothed over. However, there is sort of still this specter of division amongst NATO. What would you say these major divisions are, if they are indeed major, and what kind of barriers are there in the way of potentially preventing NATO from developing a coherent and effective response to this current crisis?
Thank you. That's a great question. I mean, I think we have to go back to, I think the core issue is everybody, in leadership positions in allied governments can see the intelligence, can see the open source imagery, can see that there are an enormous number, the largest concentration of Russian forces since the Cold War going on right now. And I would add, this is not just forces, generically. They're also deploying capabilities that you would really only deploy if you were going to take significant military action. I'm talking blood supplies, things like that don't normally get headlines, but militaries who are about to embark on a large-scale operation require. And so that is what worries me the most about the scenario where people say he's just going to posture the forces and then move them back at some point. I don't think you deploy blood supplies if you're going to do that. But so I think the major difference between Europe and the United States on this is whether there will be an invasion or not. And I think there are many in Europe who have been acting for the last 15, 20 years or so, thinking, it's unthinkable that anyone would commit military aggression in a large-scale way, in Europe. That's in the past. That's like Stone Age. That would never happen again. And I think, all of this focus was on hybrid warfare and information operations and cyber and disinformation, and everybody kind of forgot, oh yeah, that's right, military forces still do obey the laws of physics and can be used in aggressive ways. And so I think there's a little bit of dissonance on that question, where the United States thinks those forces are going to be used, and some, not all, I don't want to paint a broad stroke here, but some, not all, of European leaders just don't think that's going to happen. And so I think that's where you see a sort of a core issue. Now, stepping back, though, I think, I love NATO because it's messy, it's democratic, there's open debates, there's different points of view, but the alliance, I have to say, at this point, I'm amazed at the unity. I really am. I mean, you have sort of enormous consultation between the entire alliance in Brussels, between key leaders, Biden, Macron, Schultz, you mentioned. I step back and I'm actually kind of thrilled that the alliance is unified on this question, so unified as Talha said, that might even be getting new members. I mean, Sweden and Finland, they're in a posture currently that is closer to the alliance than they maybe have ever been. I'm not at all suggesting they need to go in that direction, but I am saying it's causing this, in many ways, Putin is unifying the alliance in a way that it's never been unified before, and there's nothing like the threat of 130,000 or more forces, massing, in the plains of Europe to trigger that kind of that kind of unity. So I think things are going pretty well, and I think this is kind of what the alliance was designed for. It's its core purpose, all the structures, processes, consultative mechanisms, military planning, all of this was designed, unfortunately, for this kind of scenario. But and I think it's paying off, and that's kind of the beauty of democracies working together.
Dr. Köse, so on this point of this idea that there's a strength, there appears to be a strengthening of NATO resolve in particular, with regards to how sort of Russia sees the scenario, and particularly with regards to the European Union, I would say, there's this sort of interesting point that Russia did not specifically mention the EU in its recent national security strategy, which was released very late last year. And this perhaps points to this idea that Moscow does not necessarily consider the EU on its own as sort of a strategic rival. Of course, the EU, many EU members being part of NATO, it's difficult to untangle in some ways. However, I'm wondering if you can speak a little bit to the potential implications for Europe in general and for the EU in particular. Should say either a full-scale invasion, but more likely, as we've been discussing here today, some sort of other action in Ukraine actually take place. How would the EU, as an institution in particular, handle such a situation, sort of outside of the NATO framework?
I think we have to consider that EU is not well prepared for this issue. So the strategic autonomy debate, is still there. But after Brexit, UK was an important army within EU. So if you exclude UK, I think European security is even much weaker in comparison to earlier. So, and also in comparison to, the conventional threats, Russia was very successful in hybrid warfare. So information warfare, support for some extreme groups, cyber issues. And we also should take into account that in the aftermath of 9/11 attacks, Europe was fragmented. There was a big gap between some European countries, members, and US, how to handle the situation. And this divergence continued for a while. The methods of how to handle the terrorism was different from the American perspective and European perspective. And also at the pandemic and 2008 economic crisis, I think there wasn't solidarity. So in the face of hybrid warfare, hybrid threats, I think Europe was fragmented, and transatlantic relations has been also fragmented. And the Europeans remember, President Donald Trump and legacy of the Afghanistan withdrawal. So we also have to take into account the 4 years legacy of President Trump, and maybe he can come, or leaders like him can come in the future. So this is also some worrying issue for European actors. So although President Biden came with the idea of strengthening transatlantic ties, the withdrawal from Afghanistan was a traumatic experience for Europeans as well as the most Americans. So Russian side definitely see this fragmentation. I think at the moment, Europe and transatlantic relations were quite unprepared for such a crisis. And it was a good timing for Russia. But this pressure, I think, makes Europe more committed to NATO, more committed to transatlantic alliance. We don't exactly know what will happen in the American side. So we know that President Biden seems to be committed, but the future president, if someone with a similar idea with America first comes, then Europeans will definitely reconsider the idea of strategic autonomy. But with a leader like Biden and with a context like this situation, I think European actors will somehow postpone strategic autonomy and will commit more to transatlantic alliance within the NATO. Yeah.
We're getting short on time, but I just want to finish briefly discuss the Minsk Accords, which has again come up in public discussion recently. Natalia, I want to come to you on this. So, of course, we have these ongoing diplomatic efforts, the most recent of which is French President Macron's visits to both Kiev and Moscow. Of course, following on the heels of the Turkish president's visit to Kiev, Boris Johnson as well, and as Mr. Prevail has pointed out, there's been a whole sort of train of different leaders both visiting and speaking with Ukraine and Russia. As we've mentioned, these discussions haven't yet resulted in any major breakthroughs. Yet, according to President Macron, at least, both Russia and Ukraine have stated their commitment to the Minsk Accords. Do you believe that the Minsk Accords can actually represent a starting point to the resolution of the crisis? From the Ukrainian perspective in particular, under the current circumstances that we're seeing, which are not the same ones that came into place when the Minsk Accords were signed, are these accords still a viable route to a diplomatic solution from the Ukrainian side?
A challenging task to make it brief, because it's a very complex and controversial for many documents. So I'll really do my best to explain that. However, it's not it couldn't be kind of the way out. It could be an exit strategy for Russia with another kind of fueling more crises, and I'll try to explain why. First of all, what this accord is about. They were signed way long time ago, 2014 and 2015, in the early stage of the hot conflict, at the moment when the Russian troops were on the ground, were in the military moment. And then in the presence of the French and president and the Chancellor of Germany and the former Ukrainian president, there was this commitment, and including with Russia, which was something very vague. Now it's very much demonized, but it was planned to be adopted in 2015. It's totally out of date. 8 years after. At that moment, there was not even a contact line. There was not even a separation. That accords were really to stop the shooting. I should say that for some time it's even worked. For a long time. So what is an essence and what is a controversy? The problem is that they are so vague that the sides interpret it in a different way. They agreed on something which could be interpreted in a different ways from the beginning. So, for instance, the biggest controversy is that there should be, at some point of time, some elections in the occupied Donbass, but Ukrainians and the internationals consider that the elections can't take place when the military are on the ground and when there are guns on the election during the polls. Russia thinks that's perfectly okay, and the troops can leave just after that. So there are these things which are interpreted differently, and that makes it very critical to move it out. But probably to add some of the things why I think that there would be, in the best case scenario, in case we avoid full-scale war, the Minsk agreement would be another puzzle to sort out, to create even more disturbance. For the last couple of years, there was some progress, and which was not mentioned, and which is rarely mentioned, that the President Zelensky has won elections 2.5 years ago on a peace platform. His government is like more dovish than hawkish. So there was a lot of compromises done by the Ukrainian side in order to change humanitarian policies to the conflict resolution. Like conflict resolution discussions, transitional justice concept developed, a lot of like other humanitarian policies were made. At this, and when I ask international partners, I also ask, like, is there anything else Ukraine can do? But at this moment, it was said, like, not really. The Minsk agreement is stalled because, for instance, at this moment, Russia is giving Russian passport to the residents of the Donbass. Any moment the sensitive issue was tackled, there was a leak from the Russian side with kind of political pretext, and the discussions were collapsing. So Russia today tries to play this game that it's up to Ukraine to implement. It's a bad game, to throw the ball to from one side to another one. But really, talking to the international partners, OSCE and the others, we could say that at the first hand, we don't see the real political will for that. And maybe during the talks, President Putin says that he wants to implement. On the ground, everything says that every smaller initiative is just blocked or manipulated, and something which is not in those accords is demanded, like direct talks with the separatists and things like that, which could create, first of all, which could create, of course, the controversy inside of Ukraine. So that could be the military action which enforce Ukraine to make some compromise when the Russian troops are again, like fighting and doing something horrible here. So it's way more complex, but everything I want to say that Ukraine was really de-escalating for the last 2.5 years. The problem that it didn't pay at all. There was no compromises during the last years from Russia, which makes this climate very bad for the hope that that would work. But as an exit strategy, with a lot of cautions, that could be, because there is no way to also dismantle them.
Okay, we're back, it seems. I'm not sure if that was from my end, but in any case, Dr. Kuze, very briefly, if you can give your comments on this, Natalia's raised a number of complex issues around the Minsk Accords, but if you can give your comments briefly on terms of, whether this represents a viable window into a diplomatic solution.
I think from the beginning on, the issue was never on Donbass issue or Ukraine-Russia issue. So Russia clearly indicated that there should be some moratorium of, NATO enlargement. And also together with Chinese President Xi Jinping, they declared in the opening of the Beijing Olympics that there should be new multipolar system, and West should stop their involvement of internal affairs of other countries or spreading the liberal values. So I think the problem is more complicated. So definitely the Minsk Accords may reduce the tension, may bring to a certain extent the escalation. But I think Russian expectation, or backed by Chinese to a certain extent, I think they need to engage further to have a more favorable European security architecture. And on the other hand, they want to have more multipolar world order. So I think the things have been stuck at that moment. So that's why I think President Vladimir Putin did not take Macron very seriously. In terms of Ukraine, this engagement may be important, but I think he wants to talk the issue more clearly with American president or some other key actors as well. So yes, these Minsk Accords are important, but I think the overall game is a little bit more complicated, and it seems that it will take longer time to settle expectations of Russian side.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's a very good point that's raised, and perhaps a topic for another discussion in terms of the relationship of this particular conflict to this larger question of the world order. Mr. Prevail, I'll give you the last word very briefly also on this topic of the Minsk Accords, but also anything that you wanted to address in terms of what Natalia and Dr. Kuze mentioned about their complications as well, and perhaps how this route to diplomacy is viewed across the Atlantic in the United States.
Well, I think my colleagues have said everything I would possibly think of saying on those issues. I do want to close with one variable. It's kind of a new variable, and it's a geopolitical one, and that is China. And so we saw an unprecedented statement from the Chinese-Russian summit meeting in Beijing, where they are getting closer and closer and closer. There's a lot of discussion. They're only going to be tactical. You know, there's issues between them. They don't agree on the Arctic. They don't agree on Kazakhstan. All those things. But I think this particular part of the geopolitical landscape is moving much more quickly than I think we're appreciating. And so any discussion of Russia, the West, Ukraine, I think we also need to at least spend a few minutes from now on discussing China, because its power is growing, and I think it's not going to get any less assertive in the international space with Xi Jinping still as president.
Yeah, and that's a very interesting point. And like we said, that's a topic for a whole nother discussion, which hopefully, perhaps you guys will be able to join us in the future for. We've gone over time a little bit. It's been a really fascinating discussion. Thank you all so much for joining us. As developments unfold, of course, there's lots of different scenarios that can play out. Natalia Goumeyi, thank you for joining us. Dr. Talha Koze and Mr. Barry Prevail from the United States. Thank you so much for taking the time to join us today, and we hope to see you again in the future.
Thanks for being here.
Take care. Thank you.
Bye.